So yes, we accept, of course, anybody's got to accept on looking at the temperature records, that it's got a certain amount warmer over the past century. But since the last UN report in 2001, and that now is getting on for 7 years ago, there has been no increase in global temperatures. Global warming has stopped. Even the Met Office, which is one of the worst of the proselytizers for the extreme view of climate change, has had to admit that global warming at the moment has stopped. So really we have reached a stasis in temperatures. And while this very exceptionally prolonged solar minimum that we're in at the moment, that's now lasted 18 months with practically no sunspots, continues, I wouldn't expect us to see record temperatures really very much. I think what's going to happen is that if the solar physicists are right, and they are near unanimous again on this, then in 10 years' time we're going to get quite a lot of solar cooling, which at the very least will offset any anthropogenic warming that we may be causing. But I wouldn't say that we aren't causing any anthropogenic warming. What I would say is that the amount of warming we're causing is near vanishingly small at the moment, and I don't expect it to get all that much bigger, even with China and India coming on stream. So let's not worry too much. Sir, have you asked one yet? Do go ahead.
Coming to the motive of why the IPCC, Al Gore, and as somebody else mentioned, George Bush's current administration is supporting the pro-environmental lobby now. I think motive is pretty important. I was wondering about the fact that if there is an environmental problem that can be actioned, if that theory survives, let's say, then you will need transnational, supranational legislation, which will mean the reduction of sovereignty for nations. I was wondering if those who might be interested in centralization of world power may have something to do with this, and therefore apparently unconnected groups such as the IPCC, the liberal left, and George Bush's lot might be being persuaded by this lot.
Thank you. That's a most interesting question, and I can give you some illumination on it. There certainly is what I would call, and I will use slightly contentious language if I may, just for once, I've been dying to all night, an atheistic, humanist, bureaucratic, centralist tendency, which, go for it, which does want further centralization of power in bureaucratic hands. Curiously, there's a rather interesting environmental effect of this. And we need here to go back to economics for a moment and cite the work of Milton Friedman, the late Milton Friedman. He died last year, a wonderful man, whom I met many years ago. And his central thesis was that if you allow the state, whether national or transnational, to do any given thing, it will cost the state twice as much and it'll do it half as well as if you let the private sector do it. Now, when we say that it costs the state twice as much, remember that cost is a proxy for CO2 emissions. Typically, if a thing costs twice as much, it's likely, broadly speaking, all other things to be equal, to emit twice as much CO2. So if you allow centralization of power to increase in the hands of governments, you are likely to increase the world's carbon footprint compared with leaving things in the hands of the private sector. So that to that extent, you get once again Monckton's law of opposite consequences in government intervention, where governments try to centralize power, and in doing so, they increase the world's carbon footprint while trying to reduce it. So there are some very interesting considerations that your question gives rise to. I myself am not a great believer in the existing transnational entities. They have tended to become expensive, corrupt, inept, lazy, and valueless. I should like to see an end to a lot of them. I don't think they do very much good, and I certainly don't see any case whatsoever for allowing the IPCC to continue in existence for a moment longer. I agree entirely with my peer, Lord Lawson of Blaby, who has called for its outright and immediate abolition. Madam, yes.
Thank you for your kind words and your time tonight. I would just like to ask, how politically viable do you believe a departure from the conventional view on global warming is, and how do you propose to overcome the unbalanced political and media presentation of the issues?
A lovely question, that, right up my street. I think we've just got to wait and watch, quietly tell the scientific truth as best we understand it, without trying to proselytize, without trying to make political points, without trying to score points off the opposition. You know, I didn't choose Al Gore for the sake of poking fun at Al Gore, or making ad hominem remarks about him, or theorizing as to why he made so many errors. I merely pointed out that there were errors in that film because it is in that film that all the fears which are being peddled by the media and the politicians are encapsulated in one place in an extraordinary way. So I think we need not worry. We need merely wait, and gradually the truth will emerge. What we need to do is to try to make sure that in the meantime as little damage is done as possible, particularly in those poorer countries whose citizens are so deeply vulnerable, as we've seen in the AIDS and DDT cases, to wrong decisions taken by us to please narrow environmentalist or other specialist vested interests who put their own interest in front of the interest of us all. One more question.
You mentioned earlier that the current major forms of sources of energy are finite. They aren't renewable. Is it possible that one of the advantages of the current green movement in advocating increased funding for research and development of renewable resources would actually lead to the replacement of these finite sources? I mean, unless, as you mentioned before, fusion does kick in.
As the existing sources of energy become scarcer, so the premium that a private company will gain by finding or exploiting or developing a new source of energy will increase of itself. It doesn't need direction by the state. That's the great thing about the free market. It responds automatically. And there's no advantage whatsoever to be gained by the state trying to get involved and say, we must subsidize windmills, for instance, to some ludicrous extent. Because that is an utterly failed policy. You know, the windmills are just not the answer. They have a marginal impact at best, and they only really pay their way in countries where they're heavily subsidized. So there's no need for the state to intervene in any of this at all, because every time the state intervenes, as I've said, it costs twice as much and is half as efficient as if you leave it to the private sector. So my feeling would be no, the green movement is not any longer a useful movement. When Greenpeace was founded, it was founded by a friend of mine, among others. And within a year he left it because he said it had been taken over by people whose agenda was not that of protecting the environment. It was an avowedly political agenda. And here I will use the word left because that's the word that he used. And he said, therefore, that it had ceased to be valuable as an instrument of environmental reform. And he wanted nothing more to do with it. And I have come across one other of the original founders of Greenpeace who has said the same. So my feeling is that the green movement now has become too politicized in one political direction. And that, of course, reduces its effectiveness anyway. And the solutions that it advocates are broadly communistic. And you only have to look at the failed communist countries around the world to see what an disastrous environmental impact they had. And I think we want to steer away from that. The private sector is, in fact, much more responsive to the needs of the environment than any state sector can realistically ever be. And I think this is a case where we just should not intervene. We should stand back and allow the private sector to do its job with a minimum of sensible regulation, but not with state subvention. And that was the last question, sir. So may I once again thank you, sir, very much indeed for your kindness in having given me the ear of the House. I should also, in particular, like to thank all of you who have not only come here, but endured several hours of me. I always find this flattering and congenial, but in your case you have asked between you a series of extremely interesting and revealing and helpful questions to which I've done my best to give straightforward answers. And God bless you all. Thank you for listening, and good night.